So welcome everyone to part one of 3 of our series on the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. By way of introduction, I was introduced to the teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov in my year of study in Israel at the Beit Midrash in Migdal Oz. And my primary teacher is a rabbi by the name of Don Hauser. He has lots of resources online, and I've reviewed some of his work also in preparation for this year. And the reason I was drawn to teaching about Rabbi Nachman is because ever since that first exposure, and this was in 2008, 2009, ever since that first exposure, Rabbi Nachman has become kind of ingrained in my way of seeing Judaism and the way that I talk to God. So it's been deeply impactful for me. What I want to do in this series is kind of introduce you to some of the major concepts. And again, this is all through my lens, the major concepts that have impacted me. And that's with the caveat of Rabbi Nachman is a man of deep Torah and a broad Torah. There is a lot out there. And so I can introduce you to resources should you want to explore further than what we'll cover in this short series. So a little bit about Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was the great grandson of the founder of Hasidism, of the Baal Shem Tov. He lived from 1772 to 1810 and founded the Breslov movement. That's what he's known for. He attracted thousands of followers during his lifetime, and his influence is still felt very strongly. We know of his Hasidim doing pilgrimages to Uman, and there's much more to know about him. I see him primarily as I learned about him, and I can conceive of him primarily as a revolutionary, in much of the way that Hasidism was a revolution, in saying, in kind of giving the authority back to the individual, and saying you can, right? It's a populist movement, right? Of saying you can take power into your own hands, your relationship with God into your own hands, your Judaism into your own hands, and that is just as valid and powerful. And that's a lot of what sticks with me from Rabbi Nachman. So today we're going to explore Torah 25, or some concepts through the Torah of 25 of Rabbi Nachman on the topic of hitbodedut, which is isolation. I guess is a way of translating that. It's from the root of like the hitboded means to isolate oneself, to go aside. Badad is someone who stands alone. Hin am levadad yishkon, right? We're described as a people who sit apart from all other peoples in the Torah. So the same root, badad. It's also the same root as boded, which is lonely, aloneness, right? Separateness, distinctness. The Torah of hitbodedut. Now, Rabbi Nachman's teachings, they're primarily collected. There are 2 books on my bookshelf I could pull off right now. If you want to, who here has a copy of any of Rabbi Nachman's books in their home? Just curious. Yeah, Tim, because Tim's got like a collection. And Lori, oh, awesome. Okay, and you guys have studied this before. You have it, but you want to crack it open, and you're using this as inspiration and encouragement to do so. Okay, so I'll just show you. These are some of my beloved books. Okay, it's interactive class. It won't work as well on the YouTube repeat whenever anyone else watches this, but so his primary book is Likutei Moharan. They call him, that's how he's referred to colloquially, like Moharan, our teacher, Rav Nachman. And Likutim are collections. So it's collections of his oral teachings that were transcribed by his student, Rabbi Natan of Nemerzov. So he gave oral teachings, and they're collected, and each teaching is called a Torah. It's called a Torah, right? And it's when I first encountered this, it sounded really, right, presumptuous, right? All of his teachings are Torah. What does that mean that there are other Torahs? So it kind of hits the ear a little funny the first time you hear it, but you get used to it and you understand. So this is Torah number 25 that we're going to learn. And we're also going to reference this book, which is Likutei Tefillot, which is a follow-up to, it's not Rabbi Nachman's work. It's Rabbi Natan, his primary disciple, composed prayers based on each of these teachings, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, of the process of turning your learning into prayers, and how that's kind of accomplished. So both of these books, this one's a little more worn than my Likutei Tefillot, so I've used this a little more, and you're welcome to borrow them anytime. All right, so we're going to talk about Torah number 25, about Hitbodedut, and I gave you links here to the primary sources that I drew upon, which is a series by Eliakim Krumbine, and I gave you a couple links there. Okay, so first we have our Torah, and we'll see through this Torah, kind of the style how Rabbi Nachman teaches, and then we're going to pick out some of the main concepts and explore them a bit together. Okay, so Rabbi Nachman is associative. He's going to speak in streams of thought, the way that my teacher, Dr. Aviezer Cohen, who taught a course on Chassidut in Migdal Oz, he talked about it's kind of creating pictures out of words and out of concepts. It's creating collages out of concepts. So we're imagining, when I read a piece of Chassidut by Rabbi Nachman, or a Torah from Rabbi Nachman, I think of like an artist on a canvas more than an author writing strings of words that are supposed to make sense together. So when you read a Torah, you're kind of, as you read more, you get more layered understanding of what each concept means in the thought of Rabbi Nachman, and then you're expected to kind of juxtapose them and see what comes out of that. So any teacher might interpret it differently. So we're just going to read through this. There's a translation here in English, and you'll see what I mean about the style. Okay. Hitbodedut. Shall I share screen? I can, and I will. The teachings of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Share. All right. Hitbodedut hu ma'ala elyona u'gdola min hakol. This self-isolation, and I has a translate Hitbodedut. It's just translated here as Hitbodedut, is of the highest level. Dehainu, likboa lo al kol panim sha'a o yoter litboded levado be'izo cheder o basadeh, which is, and often Rabbi Nachman uses this as an explanatory transition phrase, right? Hainu, this means, right? I'll say this word and explain it by another word, which might be just as enigmatic, but again, we're placing the words side by side here. He explains it means for you to set time, a set time in a set interval to do this hitbodedut, to do this kind of self-isolation and being alone with and we'll see what that means, what this practice is, in some sort of room or out in the field. And to express that with your own words, your own conversation, to make explicit your conversation between you and your creator, with claims and arguments, and also words of grace and trying to please God, and to ask and to plead before God. So you're asking God to bring you closer to service of God. And it should be in language that you speak, right? Your colloquial language, right? Which means, German, where he is. Because if you were speaking in Hebrew, it would be more difficult for you to be explicit about what's really on your mind, about what you really need. And you should say and tell God everything that is on your heart. Which would mean regret or thoughts of repentance on the past. And also requests in order to merit becoming closer to God from this point, v'hala be'emet, and onwards, in truth, with authenticity. And similarly, anyone according to your own level, that's the kind of thing you should ask for. You should make sure to make this a practice, a set practice every day at a specific time, kanal, like as we stated above. And this is also a thing that Rabbi Nachman will do. He'll say kanal, referencing anything but what he generally said before. And the rest of the day you should be happy. Now, that concept of happiness is also going to come up throughout Rabbi Nachman. He's known as a teacher who kind of struggled with deep feelings of depression. There's a biography about him called The Tormented Master, which Tim, I feel, has read maybe or knows about. Okay. So he talks a lot about this, his struggle with joy and serving God with joy and how to reach serving God with joy. So kind of this Hipodidut is this place where you kind of empty all of your emotions and all of your feelings and all of your current state of awareness. And then the rest of the day you're going about in joy and serving God with joy. And even if sometimes, and we're gonna come to this theme, we're gonna explore it further in the sources. Even if sometimes nistamamin, meaning your words get stopped up, right? You bring yourself in this intimate encounter with God, right? What he's describing is a one-on-one encounter in our own parlance, in our own day-to-day speech. It's just you and God. And sometimes you might find yourself stuck because generally we daven from a siddur, right? Generally we daven in a set manner, and there are words that we're told to say, and we know exactly what to do. But in this prescribed practice, Rabbi Nachman's kind of giving us a challenge and saying, I'm inviting you out to the field to meet God, and you use your own words. And you can imagine that might be intimidating, or if you've ever practiced it yourself, it might be intimidating. So if this is part of your regular spiritual practice, we're going to see that silence is going to come into this as well, right? So sometimes your words get stuck. And you can't even open your mouth to speak in front of God. Even so, this in and of itself, the fact that you're stuck standing in front of God and you can't find the words is very good. Why? Dahainu, because this is this is a sign that you are, right? This is readying yourself. And it's showing that you're getting ready. It's the preparation phase, right? This silence, this inability to speak is preparation for prayer. And it shows that you desire deeply, you yearn to speak to God. Right? And this yearning is a deep element of Rabbi Nachman's teachings, as well as yearning is part of your tefillah. Yearning is part of our spiritual practice, is our ritual practice as well. So the fact that you're standing there and you're stuck, that shows your yearn. You want it. But you can't, right? Practically, you can't do it right now. This too is very good. And you can even create conversation and prayer out of this stuckness, out of this silence and inability to speak. Okay, right? On that very silence, that inability to speak, you can scream out to God and beg God that you've become so distant to the point where you can't even speak in front of God. And you should know, right? I can hear the voice of my teacher singing out Vida, right? Knowing that phrase comes up over and over again. You should know this in this innate knowledge and this kind of soul knowing, heart knowing, and it's intuition. That many great righteous people said that they tell that they only reach their great mala, their great position, because they did this practice. Hitbodedut. Okay. So we're going to explore this piece by piece. I'm curious at this point if there's any something that struck you so far, something that is jumping out at you, anything new here in this teaching. Just curious of initial reactions. You can drop them in the chat. You can say something.
It's amazing to me that he actually actively encourages people to pray in a language other than Hebrew. I know that was a big departure from the orthodoxy of the time and even of our time.
Praying in a language other than Hebrew is revolutionary. Yeah. Right. And it's also striking that, you know, this was something that I brought with me into the practice of chaplaincy, where they teach you the art of spontaneous prayer and right how to pray and reflect what the person standing in front of you is experiencing. And I'm like, oh yeah, Rabbi Nachman, right? I already know how to do this. It's already part of my tradition. Yeah.
Are you talking about Shemona Esrei, Neil? Or
we are talking about Rabbi Nachman, about Hitbodedut, about the practice of finding a place either in nature or in a room alone to speak to God in your own vernacular and to empty your heart in front of God in your own words. So we talked about, that's what we just read.
I thought that was well established though. We actually build in places to do that in our own liturgy, right?
Sure, absolutely, right? There's also places in our liturgy where we are invited to insert our own needs and wants. And this is saying even outside the framework of prayer, right? Not in Shema Kolenu, in the Shemona Esrei, but you making like a date with God in the field, right? You're going out to talk to God, and this is what God asks of you,
Rabbi,
or would want from you. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, go for it, Lori.
As far as the prayers, like him saying that, you know, we can pray in our own language, which was a departure. I feel like Hisbodedut is like a very different category from like prayer. Like it's a way of praying, but it's like our prayers are, they serve a certain purpose, and they're codified and they're written and they're determined and they're very like, you know, with all the legal stipulations of it and the form and the structure of it. And this is sort of like, you know, so very different from that. And so should be so spontaneous, should be so, you know, you wouldn't go and Hisbodedut with like something, you know, written out that was like, I mean, if you want it, but like something that like, okay, we're now going to go to, you know, it's like these two like separate sides of, you know, both talking to God, but in a different, you know, different way of expressing yourself to God. And they're both so necessary. Like I always felt like they're both so necessary. And the communal structural prayer is like so powerful, but we sometimes forget, or we don't know, we're not educated that we can just have this like spontaneous, you know, conversation with God.
Exactly. I think that's the revolutionary part, is that I think what you're saying, Lori, is that they're complementary to each other, right? We have our set prayer, and there's also, right, it's also the words of the heart, right? It's the service of the heart. It was always, like Barry was saying, like, obviously, like this is meant to be that way. You're supposed to, prayer is meant to be a reflection of what's going on in our souls and bearing our hearts to God. And I think so you're saying like that we're often educated towards kind of set prayer, fixed prayer. And Rabbi Nachman is encouraging an ongoing kind of conversation with God that is less part of people's daily lives, of our daily conversation with God. Or we'd see it less as like a set practice, whereas Rabbi Nachman saying, take this informal prayer and make it a daily practice. Right, make it part of your spiritual cultivation, of your own personal cultivation. Okay, so Rabbi Nachman, I think, is taking, is basing himself on the words of Chazal as well. He's not taking this from nowhere, right? Like as you all said, like there's something that's deeply rooted already in something that we all know, that we're supposed to speak to God in our own words, and what Rabbi Nachman teaches here about taking your distance and turning that into a prayer itself. So if we're to zero in on that, right, and Rabbi Nachman says, if you find yourself standing in that silence and you can't pray, turn that itself into a prayer. What's he talking about? How would you turn that into a prayer? Okay, so this is a good exercise already right now. So we could even practice our, how would we do this or practice this in our, when we come up against an obstacle, a spiritual obstacle or something that's coming up in our relationship with God, what does Rabbi Nachman actually mean? So for example, right, if we have this and that we feel a distance, we're saying, I feel stuck. I don't know how to talk in front of God. I feel too humbled. I feel too small, or I don't have the words. What do I say? I say, dear God, I'm so distanced. Please bring me closer. Right? I feel, yeah, Barry, you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, it struck me as you were speaking that this is very reminiscent of Yearning in High Holiday Liturgy. This is exactly what our Chazan is saying, that, you know, give me the words, give me the peace, give me the way to speak to you, and don't let my flaws harm the congregation in my presenting the prayers. It's all good. It comes from me right away that this is something we should be doing right now.
Right. So we take our aspiration and we turn that into a prayer, and we say, God, we know that you want us to be at this level, or we know you want us to be able to speak in front of you. So help me be there. And that's a lot of what Rabbi Nachman will end up saying. Will say in his Torah, he'll reflect things like that. I know I want to be at this mala of wanting to learn, of wanting to daven, of wanting to do X, Y, Z. And so you turn that into a tefillah. Please, God, help me be that person. Help me achieve that in my avodat Hashem. And Tim, right before your comment, I just want to show that this is actually rooted in the teachings of Chazal. And Avodah Zarah, we have this a braita that says, the Gemara returns to a verse the sages taught with regards to the verse that says, who would give that they had such a heart as this always to fear me and keep all my commandments, that it might be good for them and their children forever. Right. So it says, I wish that Bnei Israel would always have a heart that was loyal to me, to God. And at that point, so the Gemara says, at a later stage, Moshe says to the Jewish people, you're kfuyei tova, you're ingrates, children of ingrates. When the Holy One, blessed be he, said to you, who would give that you had such a heart to be loyal to me always? What should you have said? You should have said, okay, God, you want me there? Make it happen, right? Make my heart loyal to you. And in that moment, they should have prayed to have that be true. And that's the root that's the basis of Rabbi Nachman, Rabbi Crumbine argues, of saying that's what we should turn. We should turn our distance or our own obstacles into a prayer. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, so one of the obstacles I have when I've tried this, and I have to say, I find liturgical prayer much, much easier than the spontaneous prayer. But I just, with my upbringing, I had some pretty negative images of God, and that's like an obstacle to me. So sometimes what I try, and I can't say that I'm always successful, I actually say, God, please don't be this horrible God of my childhood. Please be merciful. And I mean, it's sort of similar to the prayer in Brachot, when the prayer that God says every day, and that another rabbi, when blessed God, said the same thing, but it's kind of in my own words. So I have to bring in some of that, like, what is my image of God? Who is God? Am I having struggles with God because of negative, and I certainly hope inaccurate images of God that I was raised with? So
right. You're referring to the prayer that God says, if I let my mercy overcome my anger, right? That God prays to be a God of mercy and compassion. And so too, you're saying you pray to see God as that way, right? And that's how it seems that Rabbi Nachman is saying, right? That's how we're meant to see God, to orient ourselves. And that's what the Maharsha here says on this Gemara in the next source. He comes in his Chidushei Agadot, Mitin vayalev avam, who would give that their hearts would be loyal to God. Gam amru hakol bidei shamayim chutz miyirat shamayim. Didn't Chazal say, didn't our rabbi say that everything is in the hands of heaven except for our fear of God? Meaning, what do you mean that God should have made our hearts closer to God, right? That's our responsibility, right? That's our responsibility. We have to choose to be fearful of God. Mikol Makom, says the Maharsha, no. It's obvious that God can actually influence our spiritual life and our internal life, and God can help us along the path to service of God and loyalty to God and being a more upright and ethical person. God can kind of bring our hearts closer to that, to be good people. And there are some proofs to that. So we have to believe that, or orient ourselves to a God that can do that. Please, God, influence me for the better, right? Even as we are told, you have to choose to be fearful of God. Well, God can help us with that, right? God can help us to have that more perfect belief, or that more that closer relationship and yearning. So Rabbi Eliakim Krumbein quotes from this book called Hishtapchut HaNefesh, which quotes different teachings from Rabbi Nachman. It's a Hasidic work. And so here's what Hishtapchut HaNefesh has to say, Rabbi Nachman's teachings on this. So from all this, it is clear to the eye to what extent Chazal encouraged people to do it. It seems like that Chazal encouraged this expression in speech before God, and beseeching God that God give us fear of heaven so we don't sin, even though all is in the hands of heaven, except for fear of heaven. Still, everything is in God's hand. And so one must pray to God's self for this, as it says explicitly in the Gemara, that Moshe criticized them severely and called them ungrateful, right? God can intervene to help make us more ethical and more God-fearing, right? And even that is rooted in the psukim that we have remazim to this, we have hints to this in the psukim, that an example being in Yechezkel, where it says, I will put my spirit into you, thus I will cause you to follow my laws. That God can intervene in our internal spiritual life as well. So we can pray for that, right? Even if we feel ourselves at such a distance that we aren't oriented towards it, we can pray that God help us along that path and help us to be more oriented towards belief in God and wanting to follow God's will. Right, so in Hishtapchut HaNefesh it continues, but the truth is that this itself is the main choice of man. It's impossible for one to merit wholeness and to loathe evil and choose good and attain what one is supposed to attain in this world simply by using one's choice, but only by multiplying prayers and entreaties. So this is taking it one step further and saying, actually, we have so many obstacles up against us in this world that to ask a human being to actually use all of their power to orient themselves and use all of their energy towards God, that'd be too much to ask. There are too many temptations in the world. The Yetzer Hara is too strong. There are too many distractions in the world. So that's not really fair, right? You can't actually ask a person to make that choice all the time, except through God's help and God's support, right? So because so that's why we're actually meant to pray for God to support us in this path towards saying, I need you, right? I want to make good choices. I want to do what's right, but I need your help along with me. I need you to partner with me, God, in order to do that. And yeah, I definitely feel that in the High Holiday liturgy, it's a very strong theme as well. And this is what I'll often include in my own prayers. And when it comes to the High Holiday liturgy of God, I just want to be closer to you. And I know that you can help me do this. I need you to help me do that. So Hishtapchut HaNefesh goes on and talks about like the state of the world and why it is that we perhaps don't have all of the power to overcome all of the distractions and evil influences in this world. He references, right, this idea of the Shvirat HaKelim and right, when the world was created, God's essence was in these vessels, and God's essence became, or the light of God's essence that was in the world became too strong, and the vessels broke, and that caused some sort of rupture at the center of existence, but also means that there are sparks of God hidden in all of existence, if only we can uncover them. And so there's holiness everywhere in the world, but there's also confusion, right? There was a breaking, right? There was a rupture. And so there are obstacles to holiness, and like the sparks are hidden, right? God's access to God is actually hidden in the world. It's not so easy to understand how in our day-to-day materialistic life or in our day-to-day pursuit of, survival and flourishing, how do we actually access God in all of the aspects of our life? And also there's the Yetzer Hara. There's the obstacle that comes from this place called the Halal HaPanui, which is another major concept, that God is pervasive in the world, but there is also a space that is somehow free of God, even though no space is free of God. And there are lots of paradoxes attendant to that. But because of this Halal HaPanui, there's a place where God's divinity cannot be found through any intelligence or wisdom, but only by faith alone. And this is the aspect of prayer, right? This prayer that we do in Hitbodedut is faith, is our believing that God really can guide us towards closeness and help us when we feel distanced, when we feel the inability to make the next step on our own. And through entreaties in Christ to God, and God that can save us from the klipot and the Yetzer Hara, from the things that are pulling us towards not following what we would think is our highest calling. And that all comes from there. So it's not because of this Halal HaPanui, that's the theological explanation or the understanding of the world, right? Because there is this space that perhaps where there's this emptiness from God. That's why with free choice alone, we can't succeed in always following the paths of God, but we need God's assistance. And that's what we ask for when we're doing Hitbodedut. So that's the source. So that's how Rabbi Krumbein summarizes. He says, Reb Nachman thinks that this source of evil is not the only problem. There are moral defects in the world that do not stem from the lack of proper thinking. It's not about our rational mind and our ability to make choices and choose between right and wrong, but from lack of faith, because there's all the great thinkers who arrive at conclusions with negative, even disastrous moral repercussions were not guilty of faulty argumentation. It's not about the rational mind, right? They merely demonstrated that in the empty space, the realm where evil comes about because of so to speak, lack of divinity, intelligence can make matters worse, weakening faith, because, right, there's this kind of flaw, so to speak, in existence, right? There is this source of, or experience where, right, there can't, in Rabbi Nachman's theology, there can't actually be a place that's devoid of God, but the empty space can be this experience that we have, that we enter into kind of, and perhaps we've all been there at one point or another as believers, of entering into a space where we're not sure that God actually exists. So a moment of doubt, uncertainty, an encounter with evil or difficulty of a challenge to our faith. And that might be a Halal HaPanui, and that's where evil would come from, right? We experience the so-called lack of divinity, and that's where the Yetzer Hara would have its moment to kind of prey on that weakness. And intelligence, right, in that space, in that moment, our rational minds won't help. And what we need in that moment, right, and that there's a fundamental inability, Rabbi Nachman makes a statement about the fundamental inability of intelligence to find the truth. In that space, we need faith, that belief that God can actually help us, no matter where we are, no matter at what point we are in our relationship with God. And he continues, faith is a weapon to be used against the confusion generated by the evil of that empty space, of that point, those moments of doubt and experiencing a world without God, kiviyachol. The prayer effort, so that ability for us to say, I'm experiencing distance, and so I'm going to pray about that distance. I'm going to ask God, I feel this, I don't want to feel this, I want to be closer, and you can help me. That prayer effort is an expression of deepening faith. Reb Nachman requires this effort to be an ongoing one. The resulting spiritual ascent, when it comes, is the answer to a prayer. And therefore, it's the result of free divine intervention, on the other hand, of human striving as well, right? So it's that dynamic is our willingness to turn kind of invites us to see the divine intervention. Our willingness to say, I believe that God can be in this space and God can help me, allows us kind of to reframe all of our experiences. Once we've uttered that prayer, once we're in that moment of hitbodedut, and we say, this is what's challenging me, and we turn that challenge into a prayer, suddenly in response to that, whatever we experience can be an answer from God. There are difficulties with that, for sure, on an experiential level, right? And again, speaking from like very minor personal experience, when I would try to do this practice, right? It definitely raises your God awareness, right? Of saying, okay, I'm listening harder for God. Once I've put my prayer out into the space of the world, right? And I want to believe, and I have faith that God is always listening and God is accompanying me. So suddenly everything is kind of me in dialogue with God, right? It puts us into dialogue with God, and we've opened that. And Rabbi Nachman is saying kind of, we're really just uncovering that, right? We're always in dialogue with God. God is there. We just have to turn and open the conversation. So that becomes a beautiful encounter with God that's ongoing. And on the other hand, there can be difficulty in seeing everything as a message from God. It can be difficult. It's hard. You need to have discernment as to what you're really being called to do. And certainly that discernment is developed through cultivation of what we talked about before, of set spiritual practice, of observance of mitzvot, of regular tefillah, of learning Torah, and all of that hopefully sharpens our sense of discernment and then puts us back into this conversation that's always ongoing, even when we're not actively engaged in Torah, tefillah, chesed, whatever it is that is more of a set spiritual practice. So this is how Rabbi Crumvine phrases it, is that it gives knowledge and existential about turning Torah into tefillah. Wait, so let me pause, because this is actually a separate section. Thoughts, comments, reactions on the piece we just saw, or any of the thoughts.
I have a couple of thoughts on what you were saying.
All right, Barry.
I'm a little spacey because I've been doing some chores and whatnot, so my eyes are tired. But
Okay.
I was listening to what you were saying carefully, and it was evoking a lot of thoughts in my head. I'm thinking of things that I read and study with you in Breshit and Shemot, and a couple of things come glaring to mind. Our forefathers and foremothers, but our forefathers primarily, who have had conversations and interactions with God, and even they, each one had his own inhibitions and his doubts about what God was telling him, what God was promising him, what God was offering him. For example, Abraham, at the when God is promising him his seed will inherit land, God's saying, Abraham is amazed. What seed am I going to have? I don't have a seed. I've got Eliezer. He's going to inherit for me. Who's going to inherit for me? God says, you're going to have it. Trust me. And he goes through the covenant between the parts. Yaakov Avinu is traversing back and forth to his uncle Lavan's house, and on the way he stops in the place, Beit El, and he's there, and he's worried, and God says, I will be with you, going and coming. And yet Yaakov Avinu is still fearsome, and he says, he makes a conditional statement, at least the one that I'm reading in English translation in my Chumash. If you do this, God, then I will give this or tithe that. And Yaakov Avinu, each one of the forefathers doubted his merits to see this happen. So our righteous ones have had doubts, and our people at Yam Suf, Moshe had to calm us and say,
so
stop.
Barry, forgive me, but so it's exactly right. I think Rabbi Nachman's teachings on hitbodedut are certainly a continuation of our spiritual heritage of the avot experiencing God as a personal God and being in actual dialogue with God as recorded in the Torah. You actually skipped over Yitzchak, which I think Rabbi Nachman actually comments on, right? Yitzchak's paradigm of tefillah, of prayer, is by Yitzchak Latzuach Basadeh Lifnot Erev, right? Yitzchak goes out to talk to God,
Right.
right, in the prayer of Mincha, and like Ein Sicha et Tefillah, right? Tefillah is conversing with God, right? And that's what Rabbi Nachman actually talks about that and ties that into the practice of Hibodedut. He says, what is Sicha? Siach is also a word for plants, and that means you should go out into nature. That's where Sicha happens in a strong way, where it can encourage your flowing conversation with God. So absolutely, the Avot are certainly an example of this. And I think this is a natural outflow of that, of the Avot's example. Sure.
Is this idea that prayer and the relationship with God transcends the rational and the limits of human intelligence distinctive to Rabbi Nachman? I don't know much about Hasidic thought generally, but is that an idea that he shares with other Hasidic?
That is a great question. I wouldn't have the breadth of knowledge to answer it, but yeah, I don't know. I like, but the Rabbi Nachman, if this is an idea that's shared in Chassidut, Rabbi Nachman is certainly an exemplar of this idea. He talks about it a lot, about it transcending your rational knowledge, but I don't know.
It seems to me, I don't know if I'm muted or not.
No, we hear you.
It seems to me that there's a real kind of tension between the communal and the individual that comes out in lots of different ways. I mean, as you're talking about the Avot, I'm thinking to myself, there were arguments. There's not just a sense of communal, kind of a communion, one communing with the other, with God, help me in this kind of way or another. There's a real critique. There's an argument. There's a sense of God has an invested power or invested role in our thriving and in a sense of fairness in the world. And when that's not in place, then our need to converse with God or to confront God is very different, and it's sort of interesting to me, because as you were going through this text, at first, the idea of using your own language, and not using Hebrew, not using a language that is not yours to really flourish in and speak in. I was sort of listening to this and hearing it with another ear also, because when the reform movement, the conservative movement wanted to have Divrei Torah in the language of the people, the reaction to doing that was stark. It was really, like a schism.
Right, or prayers in German, right? That was,
right. But whatever language it was, there was such resistance to it from the rabbis of the time. And, and so it's quite interesting to me, because I don't know, I can't do like a spreadsheet to know where, who was where and everything else. But I do know that sense. So as I'm looking at this, I'm sort of going off in a separate kind of way in a little bit, but as I'm looking at this and hearing you talk, what I'm also thinking is that the communal prayer, the communal prayer in Hebrew or in the accepted, depending on your congregation, whatever, that's there for a purpose of keeping us together. That there's danger, I think, in each person going off on their own and having their own contractual kind of arrangement with God. You do this for me, I'll do that for you, or, I will behave in this way if only you would do X, Y, or Z. So I think that there's a danger to extolling the one without some sort of balance in the other.
Yeah, the reception of Chassidut as a movement was not smooth, let's say.
Oh, for sure.
Because of exactly what you were saying. And I think, all right, I don't know, the word that, I don't know whether this is actually the word to use it. Like when I learned about it in my classes, I took a couple Hasidism classes at Columbia, and we learned about like antinomianism, right? And it was about it was destroying the collective. It was going against it, right? It really was a rupture. It was seen as a rupture. right? Obviously, I'm trying to watch over that and say, oh no, it's a continuation of our spiritual tradition. Look, it's in the Torah. Look, because that's how I experience it after having synthesized all of it and it become part of the Jewish community in a smoother way. But certainly, and it was seen as revolutionary and a real problem for exactly what you were saying. And I liked going back to what Lori mentioned at the beginning, right? I think the way that I view it is that they're complementary to each other, right? There's communal prayer and there's communal practice and there's set ritual and set practice. And then there's your own personal spiritual cultivation and that you do on your own, which develops you as a person, and helps you be a better Oved Hashem.
That was a question. Sorry to interrupt. I was going to ask that because this is not saying that this is replacing the other thing. He's just saying it's good to be able to do that on your own time, so that I would take that's going to make your communal prayer more meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. It's not meant to supplant regular prayer practice.
And
it's meant to enhance.
We have those people. We have plenty of people in Israel and probably other places who kind of broke off and they do their hisbodedut or whatever they do there. They kind of made their own. What is it, like Yerushalayim syndrome? I can't remember.
They think they're the Messiah. There's no
one. There's all those like kind of offshoots, or people are like, I do my own. You always come across these like, you hear about these people like, he's an Orthodox Jew, but then he lives in like the middle of nowhere, and you're like, wait, what is going on here?
What does that mean?
We're always going to have those sort of people who kind of stray off and do their own thing, and it's kind of goes along with the whole part and parcel. But I think that so how did it work as far as like were there for was it like either people like really bought into Hasidut and like each, there was like the charismatic leader of each community, or like what about the people like us, like me and you, Rabbanit, who like we really like have that, we're really attracted to Hasidism, but we're like, we're living our lives in the modern world, but like we want to like, I feel like that's the, we want to cultivate that, like the people who like, we want to bring certain parts of it into our practice as more modern Orthodox Jews.
Yes, it's another teaching from a Rebbe of mine of like how to be normal, right? And the Torah of being normal, living a normal life, but also being spiritual and learning and connected to God. So yeah, exactly. Like I think I see hopefully my own personal spiritual path and my religious path is one of integrating like being a normal human, a rational human, but also one who is connected. So like like I said, like these texts represent like a practice, and then you take it as it makes sense and integrate it as it makes sense for yourself. Like that, the fact these Hasidic Rebbes had their followers, right? They had their people who did, who practiced to the extreme, or bought into this as the model. And for us, I'd say like we're students who are lucky enough to have a whole toolbox in our tradition of different spiritual practices and available to us. So this is like offering some of Rabbi Nachman's tools to be integrated into your own toolbox. That's what I'm kind of teaching towards, if that makes sense. Barry, I wanted to get through just a little bit more, and then we'll take some closing comments. Okay, so a little bit more on turning your Torah into tefillah, and this is something that again happens in Likutei Tefillot, where Rabbi Natan takes all of the teachings and turns them into prayers. Right, you take the ideals or the mitzvot or your value, and you pray on them. Right, you turn that into a prayer to God. So this is how it's described in Hishtapchut HaNefesh. Also, it's good to make a prayer out of Torah. That is, when one learns or hears a sermon of Torah from a true tzaddik, and a tzaddik being like an enlightened one, one who has understood the true nature of the world, kind of like the equivalent to lahavdil, like a bodhisattva, the Buddha, an enlightened person, and you go on pilgrimage to them because they've kind of found how to access truth hidden in this world. and you want to learn from them how to figure that out, how to see God in the world the way a tzaddik sees God in the world. Okay, so when you hear a sermon of Torah from a true tzaddik, then you should make a prayer out of it. In other words, to ask and beseech God for all of the spiritual levels that are discussed in that drasha, in that sermon. When will he merit that he too shall attain all of this, right? How far removed he is from this, and how he should ask God to grant that he should attain whatever is discussed in that sermon. So whatever, and you can call to mind for yourselves if there's any spirit area or mitzvah or value that you're saying, wow, like this is something I really identify with and want. That's something that would be, something that you could turn into a tefillah, right? Wow, I really wish I had more chesed in my life. God, please make me a person of chesed. Make me a person who sees opportunities, etc. Right? And you can, a simple way to integrate a practice like this into daily living, into our Jewish practice, like our normative Jewish practice. And again, he continues, this prayer and this speech should be in the spoken language that is Yiddish. Okay, so I mistranslated Ashkenaz, it's not German, it was Yiddish before, because that's in the holy tongue, it would be difficult. Okay, all right, I think we actually saw that passage. Okay, okay, so he talks about it in great extremes as well, right? So you should have this yearning until you're very close to having your soul leave you, God forbid, until you almost die, God forbid, until your soul remains connected to your body only with a thread. And as a result of great pain and yearning and pining for God, that's when you'll come with that's when your genuine prayer will be generated. Okay, obviously a very extreme situation, but we'll extract from it the idea of yearning for God. That's where the prayer comes from, of really wanting to be close to God and God's ideals in the world and living God's mission in the world. As it says in Ta'anit, no man's prayer is heard until he takes his soul into the palm of his hand. Now that's a Gemara, not a piece of Chassidut, which also shows that the Gemara can be Chassidic. There's also lots of great Hasidic drashot on Gemara itself, which is wonderful. Okay, and this last piece is just about the power of why praying in your own vernacular, in your own words, can be more effective at times than set prayer. Again, not to the exclusion of set prayer, but as a supplement. All the prosecuting angels and destroyers know all about the standard formulated prayers. They hear them all the time. They got them. They know what we're going to say. And they lie in wait for them on the roads. All right, I love this image, right? Metaphorically, it's like a well-paved road that everyone knows, where murderers and thieves lie in wait because they know the road. But when people go on a new road, which no one knows yet, they don't know there to lie in wait. So it is in our matter, because the conversation that one has with his maker is a new way and a new prayer, which a person says anew from his heart. That is why there are fewer prosecutors lying in wait. But nevertheless, Rabbi Nachman cautioned often regarding the saying of the other standard prayers as well, right? So that's speaking to all of our concerns, right? Still daven your kavua davening, but there's an extra effectiveness to this, and I think we can also see this experientially if you ever try it. Right? Sometimes we get lost in the regular prayers because we're so used to rote tefillah, right? We're so used to the words that they've kind of lost their meaning, or we never even paid attention to their meaning to begin with and learned them by heart. And when you're coming up with your own prayers and you actually are forced to think, what's on my heart? What's on my mind? Where am I in this present moment? There's less distraction that will naturally come up because you are called to be present in that moment and actually speak to God about what's on your heart, right? And you have to find the words. So practically, right, that's how I translate this, and that's why it makes sense. Lastly, he talks, this is a passage on praying in the fields, and praying in isolation. Therefore, it's very good to fear God. So he talks about the blossoming of the field, and the rebirth of nature. Sikha is prayer and yearning for God, and nature as yearning for God is a metaphor for us, right? Like there's the dead of winter where we're kind of figuring out and readying ourselves, and then the blooming and the coming, growing forth and reaching up to God. That all the bushes of the field yearn and are included in your prayer if you daven in the fields. If only you could hear the songs and the praises of the grasses, right? Shirat Asavim, which is a famous song. How each one and everyone sings to God without any self-interest or foreign thought, how beautiful and seemly it is to hear their singing. Therefore, it's good to pray amongst nature, which naturally yearns for God and repeats this cycle and represents our human yearning for a connection with God. Okay, so we also touched on this previous point of wanting to get close to God and being in silence, being stuck. That's where we started. And Rabbi Nachman says you have to be patient, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's not that easy to actually, right? I'm talking about it as if, it flows, it's just talking to God. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to you wait for it. And even in that waiting time, that itself is prayer. Beware of impatient haste and wanting your request once you've said it to be granted immediately. God gives. If not, continue to wait and pray. In regards to the words themselves, don't be hasty. First one has to be still and silent, and only wait and yearn and pine and long for the favor of God, that God grant you perfect speech. So even sitting in silence is part of the prayer. I think with that text, we're going to conclude. Final thoughts on the. There you can talk about. Maybe we'll talk about silence when we talk about nigun, when we talk about melody and singing as a prayer practice. And the melodies of the world. But yeah, thoughts, reflections in our last moments. And thank you all for joining. Yes, Barry.
I've been thinking variously off and on during this presentation, Robin, you did beautifully, that at Yom Soup, we're crying out, we're crying out, we're in fear, we're in distress. Moshe prays, and God tells Moshe, stop crying. My people in distress, this is on me. You do what you do, raise your staff, split the one. We had to, before that Yom would split, we had to wade into the water. And was it Nachman? Somebody had to wade into the water as far as he could. And Moshe raises his staff, the waters part. And that's typical of what I think is our people's journey. And yet in our people, we have to do it all together. We have to do it one by one. We're a people because we're individuals who stick together. And so we have to find that way. And we have to reach out to God. Breshit is chock full of times when God or an angel approach a person in the story at hand and asks a question or makes a statement to elicit a response. So this is our turn now. We've been chosen. We've been delegated responsibilities. We've been given great mitzvot and great rewards and great challenges. And so it's our turn to do what God did in Breshit. We have to elicit the conversation. We got to get out there. So like you said, from the silence, we have to find a way to say, Yearning, here I am. Bring it on. Let's get together. But we have to say that. We have to differentiate ourselves from the angels who are doing a job they are programmed to do. We are given free will. We have to take this free will and we have to turn it into interest and faith. And then we'll get answers.
It had me thinking, right, there's I don't know which Hasidic Rebbe teaches this or where this came from, but the Ani Ma'amins at the listed in the Siddur, loosely based on the Ikarim of the Rambam, or mostly based on the Ikarim of the Rambam. So along the lines of Rabbi Nachman saying, we pray to have the level that we want to achieve in our service of God. So there's a story about how, someone would recite these Ani Ma'amins, but add halavai right at the end, right? Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema, halavai, right? I believe with perfect faith, if only, right? It should be so. in the coming of the Mashiach, halavai, halavai, right? That I want it to be true, that I believe this with perfect faith. And that's kind of like a similar teaching in the vein of Rabbi Nachman of praying to be at the level that we yearn for, or yearning for, even to even have the yearning to approach what we see as spiritually ideal.
Is the halavai that you are of the level, or is it that the wish will be granted?
No, it's that I think that I wish I believed with full faith that this would happen. Yes.
Right. But I think that it could be, the other way around, obviously you wish
sure.
that, whatever, but, even if I had that, it's not in my hands. There's something that troubles me about an equation, that I totally understand the desire and the need, and that sense of praying in whatever language or whatever thoughts you have, and that desire to get close. But there's something that troubles me about an equation where, if you do this, then salvation, or if you do this, then that part I don't subscribe to. I think that.
Where did you see that here? I'm just curious.
I think just in what you said just now, but I'd have to go back to the text. But that sense that that the closer you come, the more you pray. I don't know. Maybe it's the sense of when you're close to death. That it. I don't know.
If you expend all of your physical energy, then
there was no. But there was something. There was something that that sort of that created that image in my head, and I think maybe it's also with the. Maybe as Barry was talking about, our forefathers or whatever, the level of piety, does not always, there's not an equation there in my mind, where someone's level of piety will mean that something else will happen.
Sure.
That's I don't know.
Well, maybe. Linda, could it be the point that she said, it says you have to be patient and wait, and the things that you ask for might not come right away, but
right, because God isn't, God isn't,
and that's that equation thing that right. I agree.
So in a sense, I mean, it may never happen, but so I think that the sense that I don't know, maybe if it's even a step beyond, or before that maybe it's there's a desire for us, with whatever level of kavanah we have, to be able to affect things, and that is part of what drives us. But I think when I take a step back from that, I think it makes us feel like we're trying to do something to affect some sort of change. But I'm not convinced that, even, like if we all baked challahs, I'm not convinced
right.
that that's going to affect the change, or the direction that we want.
Yeah. So so that, right, the text you were, I don't think that that's the causation that's being laid out of, like, if you try really hard, if you really expend all of your energy, then God will listen. I think the text you were referencing said, if you expend all your energy, then maybe you'll have an authentic prayer to say, right? Which is a different kind of thing. Okay. And I think what? Sorry, what did you say?
No, keep going. I mean, so far that's fine. I mean, that if it's right. An authentic prayer, you got it.
Right. It's right. So but it's not that, and then I'll affect, it's not a theurgy, right? It's not trying to influence God to change. I think it's more about the fact that I know to speak to God at any moment. It's about cultivating a relationship, and also then cultivating my internal orientation to say, bring this to God, right? Like, anything I have, I can bring this to God, and God is in conversation with me. Will God always answer in the way that I anticipate? No. And that's where the patience thing is coming in, of saying, God's not a vending machine, right? I'm not going to put in $1 and get this thing, right? I'm not going to put in my prayer and get the result. It's more about creating that relationship and that awareness that I'm walking with God in the world. God is always present in the world. God will be there when I'm in my most, extreme states of emotion, and God will be there when I feel excited and yearning, and then, tapped into God, and in every moment in between, right? God is present in those moments, and we have to learn. And it's about opening up that dialogue of reorienting ourselves, turning to God and saying, it's kind of saying like, God, are you here? And the answer is yes. That answer will always be yes. God is there. Is God going to respond in the ways we want? No, not necessarily. But that's what I think it's more about. It's about presencing God more than making God do something for us.
Don't you think that God is there more or less from time to time? Like in the liturgy, we have Le David during the high holidays to from Elul to Shmini Atzeret, and the appeal is approach God when he's there to hear you, when he's there to be approached, which just means to me that he's always there. God is always there, but we have to work harder at times.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Linda, are you still troubled by that? Even
I'm troubled. Listen, I'm post-Holocaust. And so,
yes.
it goes into everything, like,
yes.
hello, where are you? If not now, when?
Yes.
Yes. And so
Rabbi Nachman is decidedly not post-Holocaust.
Right, exactly. And so I find it very difficult, personally. I mean, I admire your level and others' levels of spirituality. I think it's wonderful.
I didn't say I was on this level.
No. But I mean, I can try and have conversations. I don't mean to say that I don't. But there is something. It's the image of God. It's the whatever it is that that doesn't sit well at the point where I am. Sure. Compared to and look, he experienced other kinds of things. In terms of Jewish history and everything else. I mean, it's not like it was a smooth ride until we experienced the Holocaust. I mean, that's clearly not the case. But anyway, but that is something that affects me, in such a way that I don't have the ease of language, or maybe it's the ease of expectation that God is somehow in history and able to affect things. So
or like even in history, but not answering us, like that's not enough.
I mean, whatever. It's just
I don't want to know that God is present. I want God to intervene, right? That's what you're
right. Yes. It's,
God is,
I'm not always sure that I want God to intervene. I have to say
for good. Too. Intervene for good.
Who knows?
I have heard that you can sort of sum this up by saying God answers all prayers, but sometimes the answer is no.
Yeah, right.
And
the Holocaust will be a challenge to any time we
a parallel here that we say at the beginning of Shemona Esrei, Hashem Svatai Tiftach Ufi Yagid Tilatecha. So we're asking God to open up our mouths and give us the ability to say the right things. And this is very, very much the same thing when we talk about the four sons at the Seder. We say, Sheino Yodea L'Shol At P'Taklo. So we're saying that if we can't express ourselves and we can't say the right things, or we don't know the right things to say, especially the things to get us started, then we have to be like Sheino Yodea L'Shol, and we have to say that Hashem Svatai Tiftach Ufi Yagid Tilatecha.
Right. Yep.
Well, this can go on.
Yes, and
that's a human condition.
Okay. I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna stop the recording for now, and I'm gonna officially let people go should they want to leave the conversation, and we can continue to discuss on our own. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate learning with you all. I hope you join again next time for further exploration, and you can throw out topics you want to explore and challenge Rabbi Nachman, and I will try to stand up to that challenge.
Wonderful.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Good night.
Thank you.